So last week I did the more modern version of the Adams dry fly. And in that video I had mentioned that I had done a little bit of research on this fly and found some videos where the grandson of Len Halladay, the creator of this fly, actually tied it the way his grandfather tied it. And I mentioned that I was going to go ahead and do a video on that fly. And you're actually looking at the results. This is the fly actually as I've tied it. The interesting thing is a lot of these videos that I do, I will tie at least half a dozen. So like when I did the Adams, I think I tied up a dozen of them. And that is so that I have the fly down well enough that while I'm tying, I can also be talking about it. Sometimes I'll get a little tongue-tied, or you'll hear me kind of thinking about something and there's a pause in my speech and everything. That's because I'm just trying to think of how I want to phrase things, but at the same time, my hands need to keep tying the fly. So I tie them so that I'm familiar with them when I do the video. This one, I didn't do that. I just thought about it last night before I was going to film this, that it would be kind of interesting to just do this. This is the first time I've ever tried to tie a Adams the way Len Halladay tied it, as per the video of his grandson. And so what you're about to see is me actually doing that for the first time. It's very interesting how this pattern is different from the modern day Adams that we fish these days. But this is pretty much like, with a minor exception or two, just like the grandson did. So that's Len Halladay's grandson's Adams, and I'll get started tying. I'll start this Adams with a Mustad 94-831. It's a 3X long dry fly. This is size 12. I think that these longer shanked hooks are better for the Adams because of the much thicker collar. I'll debarb the hook. Make sure that's in there real well. For thread, I'm going to use a Uni 8/0 in black. So very similar to, let me get that straightened out a little bit. Very similar to the Adams dry fly that I did last week. I'm going to attach my thread here and put the tail in first. Now the tail on Len Halladay's version, or I should say that he created, of the Adams, is golden pheasant tippet. I have seen as little as 2 barbs from the golden pheasant and as many as 4 or 5. I'm going to put in about 4. I want to go ahead and take some of the ones that are a little, I don't want to say fuller, or just a little bit more pronounced. The colors on them are really, really nice. And I'm just going to get about 4 of these. I can count those out. Like I said, I've seen some of these tied where he just had 2. And then the video where the grandson tied it, he had 4 of the tippets in. I don't think it's that critical. Again, I'm doing this more as a historical kind of thing, in terms of this is how, Len Halladay did the original Adams. Wrap that down at the end of the shank. Now, in his video, his next step is to tie in some wool. I'm just using a gray wool. This is an acrylic yarn, more or less. I could not find in time to do this a actual just natural wool. So I'm going with just this acrylic. The interesting thing is when he tied in further up the hook shank, wrapped the wool down, and then actually put a wrap of wool up underneath the tail. That's one way of doing it. And I suppose that would be, obviously that's the way he did it, and supposedly how Len Halladay did it. It ends up with a little bit of a bump right back here. I'm going to forego that. And at this step here, I'm just going to put a wrap of thread. What that does is it just helps to prop up that tail a little bit in the back. And then I'm going to go ahead and just tie in the wool as most people these days would tie it in, just as the underbody here, going on up to the end of the body so that we can wrap that in for the actual body of the fly. I want to make certain that I do have this wrapped all the way down the end of the shank. There, that will kind of maximize the length of the body here. Then I'm going to wrap my thread up to almost about 3/4 up the hook shank. I really want to leave about a quarter to a third up here, because in this version, the hackle actually gets tied in. The wings are way up near the front up here, and the hackle gets palmered in and just brought up in front of those wings and tied off. So there's really no wraps right up in front. So body can be a little bit longer on this. I'm not concerned about getting a real taper in this. As I said, if you watch the video where the grandson ties this, it really is rather interesting because the body itself really kind of shaggy looking, and it's got this kind of pronounced bump in the back. And I don't know if that was put in there for a reason. Obviously, that was done that way for a reason. I think it was because he wanted to get a wrap of yarn right underneath the tail to help support that tail sticking out. So with the body tied in, we have the hackle and the wing to finish on this. He is using hackles from, in the original, I think it was I'll probably get these names wrong, a Rock Island Red and a Grizzly. I don't know what the name of that chicken was. Len Halladay actually raised them for meat and produce, but also saved the feathers and the necks for fly tying. So he's using basically a brown neck and a grizzly neck hackle. And I point that out because in the other video that I did, I was using saddle hackles. Well, the saddle hackles off of, I'll show you this one here. This is a saddle hackle, off of that skin that I had for the other Adams. And if you look at it, it's pretty much uniform all the way the length of that hackle. That's the whole point. The saddle hackles are really nice because let's say this particular hackle works well for a size 12. I've got the length of this is almost about 10 inches, 11 inches. I've got enough for at least 3 or 4 flies out of this. I'm pointing it out because in the video that his grandson did, he's actually using the capes or neck hackles, which are different. They are wider down here towards the base, and they get skinnier as you get up towards the top. So you have to find that area of the hackle that's going to have the barbs, the length that you're looking for that fly. Now, he actually tied 2 of the brown in and palmered both of those at the same time, and then 1 grizzly hackle. So I'm going to do more or less the same in that I've got two, that actually is two hackles right there. The brown, I'm going to tie those in, and then I'm going to take my Grizzly and tie that in. Pretty much only going to get about 4 or 5 wraps of each of these as you go around the shank. Like I did in the other Adams and other dry flies, I'm leaving the rachis down here bare a little bit, so as I start to wrap that in, my barbs will actually stick out perpendicular to the hook shank. Now, then, according to the original way it was tied, you come up to about an eye length, maybe a half an eye length behind the eye of the hook, and we're going to tie in the actual wings on this. Again, the wings were used from the same cape, and we're just using the very tips of these hackles here. So they're much more pointed, and they're not nearly as round as most of the hackles and dry flies that you would see, Adams dry flies that you would see today. What I'm looking for is one that isn't quite, I mean, this is too narrow as far as I'm concerned right there. I want something a little bit fuller, so I'm going to choose this one here. I'm going to clip maybe about a third from the tip on down. And they do have a bit of a curve to them, so I'm going to tie these in with the dull side up and that curve kind of coming up this way. I'm going to tie this in here, just a couple of loose wraps right across the front here. And then I'm going to pull this back to the length that I'm looking for. And the length is basically about the length of the shank of the hook. Pulling that out, I'm going to get a couple of wraps in behind it to kind of wedge that a little more forward. And when you watch the video, you'll see he actually ties these in more of a spinner style. So the wings are actually right up near the front here, and that's maybe a little bit long. I'll do the same for my other feather. I'm going to clip off the tip maybe about a third of the way down. I'm going to tie that in on my side here. Just get a couple of loose collecting wraps. Pull that back. I'll keep the same length, even though that's probably a little bit long. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to get some wraps behind that, kind of wedging that forward. Clip off the excess. Put some wraps up here, wedging that one back forward a little bit. And as I said, his were more or less kind of slanted forward and definitely more out as a spinner as opposed to upright wings, 45 degrees, all that stuff. Now you'll notice that I have maybe about a half an eye length behind the eye of the hook. That's just to tie in those hackles as I get those wrapped in. So first, I'll take the two brown hackles. Excuse my reach, I'm getting my hackle pliers. I have seen other videos where people have tied, the Adams more or less how Len Halladay did, and they only used one. I'm going to put another wrap back in the They only used one brown hackle. So, it's kind of up to you, I think. I wanted to do, this is more or less, like I said, just like the video that the grandson did. See, and that's the problem. If you do two of them, you're going to end up getting those two feathers spreading out and tying in different because they're under different tension. Okay, I'm going to come back one more time, reattach, give that another shot. So we're going in pretty well. Remember, this is the first time that I've ever tied the Adams this way and attempted this. So it's not rehearsed. It is not, I haven't fleshed out the fly or anything like that prior to actually tying it. Then the last wraps are just going to come right up here in front of the wings and wrap in. Might have been able to get another wrap of the brown back there. And then we will put in the Grizzly hackle. If I can get a hold of it. Even the way that Len Halladay did this is still very much a very, very full collar of hackle around those wings. I am going to use my little half-hitch tool here to kind of push some of those barbs away from the front of the eye. There in the video with the grandson, he actually mentions that Len Halladay used I guess, an interesting little finish knot he did on the Adams and in his fly tying. I did not get a good view of that, so what exactly that was, I don't know. You can see where he's tying the fly. It's interesting because it's in a vise, but he's not using a bobbin to hold the thread. He's actually tying it with his hands, manipulating the thread with his hands. So he's often putting in half hitches to secure the fly up to a certain point. So that is the Adams, more or less the way Len Halladay originally tied it. Put some head cement right up here between the two wings, a little drop, soak in down there on those thread wraps. And that is, as far as I know, the original Adams. And I got 5 of those Tippets in there. Oh, well. So, again, this was just kind of a fun video to do. As I was doing the video on the Adams a couple of weeks ago, I got more and more into the history of this fly. And when I ran across the video of the grandson tying it, I just thought it was rather interesting because we often look at the flies that we tie and fish these days and aren't aware of what they looked like when they were originally created. Tyers back then didn't have the internet to worry about and the Instagram and everything, so they weren't pressured to make their flies look just perfect, the best thing that's ever been tied. They were tied to be fished, and they were made to catch fish. So you can see this version of the Adams is very different than the version that we fish today. It's not completely different because it still has the gray body and the brown and Grizzly Hackle fibers, but the wings are definitely, this is much more of a spinner type, the wing, the way he has those set up. And those are a little bit long, but I'd still fish that. Matter of fact, I may take that out this summer and actually fish that at some point. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. That was my attempt at tying Len Halladay's original Adams. Thanks for watching today. Thanks for joining me at Devise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.